Welcome back to my solution for challenge 4 of Chapter 3. Counterintuitive. If you created your code in data of Chapter 13, then you could add my code to data of Chapter 3 folder. The code for ch for _counterintuitive.svelte is in the link provided. Alright, a quick recap on the objective. We are going to use 3 runes, state, derived and effect, to reactively update a counter message for each rune. Since we have 3 very similar blocks of markup, we will use a snippet. Okay, let's jump into the code. Okay, now, I have the component loaded and displayed and my code, and I want to start by showing the snippet. You will recall that the snippet is basically like a function with parameters, and those parameters are the things that are variable within the markup. So, looking at the display, we can see the heading is different for each section, bring the name of the rune. The colors are also different. And the message is potentially different as the count can be different for each rune. So, these become our parameters. I have just called the heading label. You define the snippet using #snippet and give it a name. I'm calling it countercard. And then you have the parameters label, color, and message. Now after the heading we have 3 buttons, increment, decrement, and reset. Each button calls function changeCount with the heading, label, and an amount, +1 for increment, -1 for decrement, and 0 for reset. Now, while I think of it, when you are using events like the onClick here and you want to call a function with parameters, you need to use an inline function, as I am doing here. You can't call a regular function with parameters. So, if I had onClick equals changeCount, label 1, calling the function directly, instead of an inline function, this would not work. After the buttons, we have the reactive message. So that is the snippet. We need to call this snippet 3 times, once for each rune. As you will recall, you use the @renderSnippet name to render the snippet. So, this is where we pass in those parameters, the values of which differ for each rune. First, we render the snippet for effect with the parameters for effect. Then we render the snippet for derived. Lastly, we render the snippet again for state. And that is all our markup. Let's go and check the script now. State is declared for each of the 3 counts, each of the 3 colors, and 2 of the messages. Why not 3? Because you do not need to declare state for $derived, as it handles that automatically. However, for $effect, you do need to declare state first. Okay, next, reactives. First, we have an effect to reactively update message effect. The effect calls function msg with parameter count effect, which is the counter for the effect rune, and this is a dependency. So, anytime count effect changes, which it will if any of the effect buttons are clicked, then the effect triggers and updates the message display, reactively. If we scroll down to function msg, we see that this sets up the message based on the value of the count passed to it. This function came about through refactoring the code, as I was using the same logic for the derived message. Next, we have a derived rune for the message derived. Similarly, this calls the msg function, but now with count derived. And that's the reactives. Next, functions. We already covered the msg function, accessed in both effect and derived. Next, we have update message state function. This also calls the msg function with count state. So, whereas the counter message is reactive for derived and effect, it is not for state. For state, we need to call the message counter function anytime a button for state, increment, decrement, reset is clicked. Otherwise, the message for state would not update. And that is why immediately after declaring this function we need to call it. The next function is changeCount. Remember, you saw this being called in the snippet with different parameters for each rune. In your solution, as in mine initially, you may have several functions doing pretty much the same thing, but for each rune separately. So, I refactored and came up with this function. The change count function is called with parameters label and amount and has if sections for each label. It uses the AMT parameter as +1 to indicate an increment, -1 a decrement and 0 for reset. So basically, this function sets the count and color for each rune. The color calls the next function. And the final function is getRandomColor, which does as it says and returns a color which is then used in the changeCount function. And that completes this challenge, which was to show you how you can use each of these 3 runes to achieve the same results. I have a question for you. If you had to reactively display the counter message defined before, would you use state, effect, or derived? The answer is in this particular case where you are clicking buttons to change the counter value, which changes the message, there is no need to use derived nor effect. You can simply use state. Only use reactives if you need to. In SvelteKit 5 Runes mode, you are required to use $state, which use signals, under the hood. Use derived when you want to derive a value based on other state. Use effect sparingly and when you want a side effect. Let's recap what was covered in this challenge. The key concepts covered in this challenge were: reactivity, demonstrate how SvelteKit 5's $state, $effect, and $derived can be used to create reactive components. State management, use $state to manage the counter state and $effect / $derived to update the UI based on state changes. Reusable snippets, define and use reusable snippets to render UI components consistently. Event handling, implement event handlers, on-click to update the counter values and react to user interactions. User reactives only as needed. Here we could have used state only. Use $derived when you need a value based on other state. Use $effect sparingly when you need a side effect. And that, my friends, wraps up challenge 4. Please leave comments, like and subscribe for more exercises and challenges. Drop me an email with your code or questions. See you in the next video for another challenge.